Hi, everyone. This is Vidya Frazier. Welcome. This is the second YouTube in a three-part series in which I'm describing how to recognize which dimensional consciousness you may be operating in at any given time. I'm offering this mainly to point out that you're likely shifting in and out of three very different dimensions now during these final tumultuous times that we're in before the Earth shifts into 5D. And this may be confusing you or making you feel a little bit crazy. It's important to understand that although your body will be staying in the third dimension until the Earth makes its shift into 5D, your consciousness can now shift in and out of 4D reality and even at times 5D reality. So in the first video, I described some of the basic ways you can recognize when you're operating in 3D consciousness. And some of these are obvious, right? But some aren't. And in this one, I will be discussing what I call 4D consciousness, which is a lighter, calmer state of being. And I'll also describe ways in which you might consciously shift into it when you're feeling stuck in 3D consciousness. And then in my third YouTube, I'll describe the qualities of 5D consciousness, which you may also be slipping into from time to time. So hopefully, this series will help you understand what's happening and realize which dimension you happen to be in when certain things are going on with you. And also help you to see clearly that as you learn to raise your frequency into a higher dimension, you will actually change your reality. As you probably know, it's your frequency that determines which reality you're living in, right? Now, one thing I want to say first, though, is that there's no definitive hard line between dimensions. It's more like the colors in a rainbow, right? So for instance, higher 4D dimensional consciousness is very similar to lower 5D consciousness. They kind of blend together. So sometimes it's not always clear which dimensional consciousness you may be in when certain things are happening within you. But I'm attempting in these videos to describe states of consciousness that are kind of obviously in one dimension or another, just to give you an idea of the important differences there are between them. So, okay, I'm going to describe here some of the important aspects of 4D consciousness so you can recognize them when you're in them. And then I will offer some ideas of how to shift into 4D when you feel stuck in 3D. All right, so the first rather obvious indication to point out that you're in, 4D consciousness is something I'm sure you're aware of, and that's when you notice how time has become really weird. You see that it can both stretch and condense itself in strange ways. Mainly, some days seem to just fly by, right? Weeks and months just whiz past. But sometimes you might also experience how a day just seems to drag on and on and on. In other words, time has somehow become elastic. This is 4D. But in general, you notice that your whole experience of being in time itself is shifting. For instance, it can get very difficult at times to keep track of what happened just yesterday, or even just a few hours earlier, because the memory just isn't there somehow, or it's confused. You can't quite remember when something happened. All you're really sure about is what's happening in the present moment. Or you might realize you're trying to make plans for the future that never quite pan out. That you can't plan anything for sure because unexpected things keep happening. Or you try to tune into the future and it somehow just feels blank. So you realize you have to just keep bringing yourself back to the present moment. And you may see that things do always kind of work out okay anyway, if you can just stop trying to control things. You can find that essentially all is well so long as you just follow the flow and feel into where the openings are, where the next easiest, most obvious step will take you. So this noticing of how weird time has become is an easy way that you can realize you're operating in 4D consciousness. You can see that linear time is somehow disappearing and collapsing into the present moment. Okay, so a second indication that you're in 4D consciousness is when synchronicities seem to be happening left and right. Maybe you're reading a book about a certain really unusual subject, and then you hear someone in the line the next day at the drugstore talking about that same weird thing. Or, you're somewhere realizing you need help in doing something, and suddenly someone who is perfect is just walking by ready to help you with it. Or maybe you forgot to add something to your grocery list, and you just happened to hear someone talking about, that very thing just as you walk in the store. Or, maybe you're going out the door to go find someone, and you see them as soon as you open the door. It's just these magical little synchronicities that keep happening. And you may also be catching double and triple numbers on the clock or in other places, or seeing license plates that speak to you. And then, like I say, there are these little miracles that happen from time to time, unusual things that surprise you and seem to magically help you in one way or another. So these kinds of experiences are really delightful to experience, as I'm sure you know. And you can know that when they happen, you are likely in 4D consciousness. You bring them to you. In fact, all of these experiences are actually an important aspect of a phenomenon that's occurring now. And that's that what's been called the veil is now thinning. The veil between physical third-dimensional reality and what's always existed in the more invisible realms of reality. And what this means is that when you tune into 4D consciousness, another thing you find out is that it's now easier for you to tune into realms of great beauty and knowledge, and to experience spirituality more directly, not just as concepts or teachings you've read or heard about. Also, you realize more clearly that God or Source is a force that's within you, right? Not somewhere outside of you, which is a third-dimensional experience. You're not petitioning or pleading with some godlike father figure to do things for you. You're more aware that you are actually a powerful being filled with source energy, and you're experiencing these much higher aspects of yourself that you've never experienced before. You can also realize that your higher self is multidimensional, that there are many aspects to it existing in different dimensions. And they're all now beginning to anchor within you, within your physical body. You no longer have to reach up and out to contact higher wisdom. You can realize that it's all within you, actually within your body. And you can further become aware of your energetic bodies on an experiential level, your etheric body, your emotional body, your mental body, your spiritual body. These are bodies that stretch way out from your physical body. And you may also become aware of how you, as a light being, stretch even further out than that, and even begin to sense your energetic connection to many invisible beings and forms out in the universe. And also, with the veil thinning, you may discover certain psychic gifts you now have available to you, such as telepathy. You're picking up on thoughts and information from other people's minds. Or maybe you're discovering that healing information or skills are beginning to, appear in your mind. Or other psychic gifts, such as knowing something is going to occur before it does. Or you realize you're remote viewing, or channeling, or speaking light language, or maybe discovering new creative talents that you never knew you had. In other words, when in 4D consciousness, you can more easily open up to wisdom and experiences that enhance your understanding of the magnificence of who you are. And you can also become aware of other beings that have been invisible to you when in the third dimension. It can be very exciting when all this begins happening for you. And this is a big part of living in 4D consciousness. However, and there is a however here, it's important to also realize that along with new openings into these beautiful, invisible realms, with the thinning of the veil that's occurring, there are also now openings that are happening into the lower frequency realms, such as the lower astral, that have also been beyond the veil as well, in which lost souls and dark entities have always existed, ever since alien forces first arrived on this planet many thousands of years ago. In fact, since the veil has been thinning and actually disappearing in certain areas on Earth, these entities and energies have now been flowing much more easily into our physical third-dimensional reality. And they've been entering into people's auras and sometimes attaching to them. And this is one of the reasons so many people have become so disturbed recently, and the events on Earth have become so violent. These dark energies are now freely flowing around us. You know, they've always, to some degree, been able to cross over into our reality and attach to people, but now they're much more free to do this. Because as the veil continues to disappear, the astral realm is actually merging with our physical one at this point. And this is kind of scary, but do be aware that this is only going to be happening for a period of time. As the Earth continues to rise in frequency, these lower astral beings will eventually not be able to go with us. They will be transmuted into light or sent elsewhere into the other timeline that many people are now traveling on, headed into a whole different direction away from the timeline that's headed now for the fifth dimension. However, it's important to understand that for now, as I say, these lower realms and realities are merging with the reality we're currently still living in. And it's helpful to remember to keep yourself as spiritually safe and protected as possible by remembering to surround yourself with divine light and calling in celestial beings to protect you, especially when you find yourself with people who seem disturbed in some way, angry or fearful or despairing. You know, consciously keep your own frequency high, especially when you're around other people. So staying aware of all of this is part of being, in 4D consciousness. Not in fear about it. That's 3D. Just staying aware and being smart in navigating your way through it. And this leads me into mentioning another aspect of 4D consciousness, and that is having at least some further awareness about the darkness humanity has always been dealing with. How, in particular, humanity has been living in a false matrix for many thousands of years, ever since alien, hostile beings known as the Archons, as well as other races who eventually joined them, entered onto the planet and essentially took over what happens on Earth. And this is an entire story about humanity's history that I know some light workers just want to avoid, and that's understandable. But it really is necessary to know about and understand, at least to some degree, in order to fully understand why you and everyone else on Earth has been in such suffering and darkness for so long. In 4D consciousness, you recognize that there's a very real spiritual battle that's occurring during these times for the future of humanity. You know that the deep state is very real, that there's a small elite group of people attempting to depopulate the world so that humanity can be even more controlled, and that they're still planning pandemics and other atrocities to weaken and decrease our numbers. And you also realize that there are military forces along with benevolent galactic forces that are fighting against these people, helping humanity to win this battle. You're aware that, of course, some of the stories about these things are not always real or they're exaggerated, but that the general story is very real. There's a lot of evidence for this now if you just do your research. And if these ideas are new for you, or if you've attempted to avoid them or called them conspiracy theories or science fiction in the past, it may be difficult for you to accept them. It can initially bring up some real fear. But once you decide to finally learn about them, you can realize how much it all makes sense. Why humanity has been held down for eons, both in consciousness and physically. And also how both religions and New Age spirituality teachings have been infiltrated to keep humanity weak, in constant suffering and in perennial war. And so this understanding is necessary in order to fully function within 4D and 5D consciousness. Among other things, it's part of the process of breaking free from the 3D control that you've been under. You realize that just trying to stay in love and light isn't going to cut it at this point. Trying to stay in that state of mind will not help you navigate these times safely. And at the same time, it is, of course, as I say, necessary to not fall into fear or powerlessness or anger about all of this stuff. That's a guarantee to fall back into 3D consciousness. But you gotta simply maintain awareness about it all and to keep track of how to keep yourself safe and in control of your own life as the world moves through this phase of the end of the Earth's transition into 5D reality. Okay, so another common aspect of 4D consciousness you might recognize can be seeking spiritual guidance through the use of various types of psychic symbology tools, such as astrology, tarot cards, candles, crystals, and other objects, or performing certain ceremonies to create energetic results, or maybe seeking out people to read past lives or other psychic information about yourself. Now, of course, these types of tools and activities could also be used when in 3D consciousness. But then there's more of a desperation involved, an intense need to get answers through these outer means and symbols and not know how to get any answers inwardly. Whereas when you're in 4D consciousness, there's more of an approach of, using them to maybe get a little better direction when trying to make a decision about something in your life. You're not depending solely on these types of things. You're mainly going inward now and doing your best to find answers from your intuition or your guides. And you'll discover at some point, as you begin shifting more and more into 5D consciousness, that you won't be drawn to these outer forms of receiving guidance so much at all. There won't be a need. You'll find that life operates in a whole different way, really, in which you'll just be inwardly guided where you need to go and what you need to do. And you'll just basically pay attention to this. So all of these experiences are indications of what your spiritual life might be like while functioning in 4D consciousness. Now let me describe some other signs of what living in 4D can be like. And one of them is that you might begin to realize that you're wanting to spend more time alone these days, just kind of resting in your own energy, more time quietly contemplating reality, maybe more time in meditation, maybe more time out in nature. Outer world and events and interactions with a lot of other people, become somewhat less important to you than before. And certain people you used to hang out with don't interest you that much anymore. Some of your old friends just kind of drift away. You may find your nervous system is more sensitive to noise and mindless chatter. When people's conversations seem superficial, your attention just kind of drifts off. And at a certain point, you may even feel as if you're in a type of void. And this is something I've called the Ascension void. This is where, this more inward draw is happening more and more deeply. And you begin realizing your world and life have become a lot smaller. and even somewhat solitary. It's a time in which you become aware that a lot of your old interests and passions are just no longer alive in you. At times you don't even know who you are anymore because so much of your life has changed. And experiencing this can be kind of scary, but it's important to realize that it just means you've really entered into 4D consciousness. And this is just part of the journey. It won't last forever, but it's a time in which to realize that something is really shifting in you, and you just need to let it be and let it do its thing. It's a time in general in which you can spend a lot of time evaluating what you've done in your life and, realizing what's important and what isn't anymore. You become more aware that you're transforming energetically and you're getting ready for an even bigger shift in frequency that eventually will be happening. And so then there's something else that may be happening as well. You can realize you're in 4D consciousness if you're someone who has always kind of followed the news and been politically involved, because now you realize, you're still interested in following world news, but you're responding differently to it now. You know that important and intense changes are now happening on the planet as many old and corrupt systems begin collapsing, and you see battles between the light forces and the dark forces being fought all over the planet. But now, having shifted into a higher frequency, you don't generally get drawn into deeply emotional reactions to everything as you once did. And you also don't get pulled into divisiveness about politics anymore, taking hard stands on political issues. You're keeping an eye on certain dangers that may personally affect you and your loved ones, and also on anything positive that may be happening to occur at long last. And you remain compassionate for all those suffering in the world. But in general, you keep focused on the big picture of ascension that's happening on the planet, realizing it's a gigantic and intense shift that humanity needs to live through in order for the shift into 5D to finally occur. And you realize that the whole drama that's occurring on the planet is part of what is naturally happening as the third dimension slowly comes to an end, ushering in a whole new higher frequency called the fifth dimension. So, along with this shift, into a quieter response to what's happening in the world, you may also realize that you aren't listening to the incessant mind chatter happening in your head quite as much anymore either. You're especially tuning out all the negative stories about yourself that may be flowing out from the implant in your brain that's been called the inner critic, but which in actuality is an ancient technology that was inserted into the human brain by that alien race called the Archons that essentially took over the Earth thousands of years ago. You're realizing more and more that these messages are programmed into this part of your brain and have been designed to cause you to feel weak and guilty, ashamed, and fearful. And you're no longer believing the stories it's telling you. And related to this, yet another shift you might notice within yourself when you've risen into 4D consciousness is a shift in any practices you've done for a long while in terms of self-improvement or healing of difficult aspects in your personality. First of all, you can realize that now that Ascension is speeding up, and it really is now, all the unhealed traumas and woundings from the past are now surfacing from the unconscious. They've been in there stuck because you couldn't handle them, until now. But they are coming up in order to be released. And it's important to realize this so you don't fall into getting upset and thinking something's wrong with you and that nothing has ever gotten healed. It can feel that way, but it's not true. Instead, you can recognize that this arising of old unresolved traumas is part of the ascension process during these transitional times. And what you can choose to do is stand back and just watch the process of release while keeping yourself back from getting entangled in all the emotions that are arising. But something else you may begin realizing is that the way you've done healing work in the past is also changing in another way now. And healing, of course, it's an important process in the ascension journey, no doubt about that. Many of the woundings and traumas you've experienced in your life do need to be seen and compassionately worked with and hopefully healed as much as possible. But if you've been at this for a long time, at some point you may realize that nothing much seems to be changing anymore with all the healing work you're doing. You definitely feel better, lighter, freer, more awake than before you started on this whole healing journey. But now it all kind of bores you. New things to fix and heal just keep showing up. And you're just tired of, trying to perfect yourself all the time. It feels never ending. And when this happens, it's a sign that you've now entered deeply into the fourth dimensional consciousness. You realize that the 3D self you've been trying to fix for years is simply imperfect. It's just part of how it's always naturally been. In a certain way, it's just been a product of the controlled reality in which you've been manipulated and stunted and prevented from knowing who you really are as a powerful, multidimensional being. And you're now realizing that the urge toward constant perfection is all part of programming to keep you weak and in self-judgment. It can be really freeing to realize this, to get that you don't have to keep doing this never-ending healing work anymore. Now, of course, certain things, you will have to keep an eye on, certain old reactions or emotional holes that you slip down into. And maybe you'll continue to, seek out healers to help you with issues you can't seem to figure out for yourself. But in general, you can realize that you can simply let yourself be and just focus more and more on developing more love and compassion for yourself just as you are. Right? What a relief. So, okay, I've been describing here certain experiences you may be having, that indicate you're operating in 4D consciousness, and hopefully you can relate to them, or at least most of them. But as a brief review, let me mention them quickly again, because I've gone over a lot here. So you're in 4D consciousness when you're noticing that, first of all, time is weird. It's becoming elastic. Linear time seems to be disappearing. Synchronicities are happening. Little miracles are happening for you. You notice it when you see that the veil is thinning. You realize that new realms are opening up to you, wonderful ones, new creativities coming in, new psychic gifts are appearing. But you're also aware that the lower astral is collapsing, and entities are flowing into this reality too, and you're needing to protect yourself more. Also, if you're drawn to using things such as tarot cards or other psychic tools, you're not so dependent on them anymore. You're wanting to spend more time alone or out in nature. You may be experiencing the ascension void, with fewer people in your life. You've lost your passion for old interests, and your sense of identity is changing. Perhaps your response to world news is changing. You're no longer so reactive. You're not choosing sides so definitely. You're focusing more on the big picture that's happening. And very importantly, you're not listening to and believing the inner critic messages so much anymore. And finally, you're approaching your healing journey differently now. You're just basically letting yourself be. So some of these experiences are kind of fun, right? Some are kind of strange, but all of them really are experiences that are lighter, freer, and calmer than those indicating that you're living in 3D consciousness, a much denser, heavier consciousness filled with suffering, a lack of awareness of who you are on many higher levels, and a feeling of being rather small and powerless, often a victim. So now let me describe some ways in which you can make a shift from this dense 3D consciousness when you happen to find yourself there into the higher, freer, and more relaxed energy of 4D consciousness, like I've just described it. The first thing you need to do when you do get stuck in 3D consciousness is to become aware that that's what's happening. You're stuck in 3D. And this recognition is a really powerful step because just achieving this sometimes can break you free from the constraints and the suffering you're experiencing when you're feeling stuck there. But even if this doesn't immediately occur, just realizing what's happening can bring light into what's occurring within you. And you might just decide to let go of what you've been thinking about for a bit, realizing it's toxic to your sense of well-being. And you can decide to just focus on something else for a while. Or, maybe go for a walk or a run. Or maybe a swim to just shake it loose. Or maybe go and take a nap. But if you can't do anything like that, or if that doesn't work, to turn off the annoying record that's playing in your head, there are other things you can do. So, for instance, what you can realize is that when you feel stuck in negative emotions and thoughts swirling around inside of you, you're likely stuck in your mind, the mind that's connected to that implant known as the inner critic. Once you realize that that is where your attention is focused, in the mind, you can then shift your focus out of it. And one way to do this is to shift your attention out of your head and your mind and down into your chest, into the area of your heart. And in doing this, you can, first of all, just focus on watching your breath for a minute or so. And you'll find that almost immediately, the mental noise actually stops. The repeating messages stop because you're no longer focused on thoughts in your mind. Now, you may still be feeling somewhat powerless or weak or sad or whatever, but not so much. It's somehow softer. It's quieter. You're now aware just of feeling, not also with the thinking in your mind. And if you keep your attention there in your chest and then down into your gut as well, then you'll likely become very aware that there's a tightness or pain there, and emotions are still rolling around in there. So the next step is to focus there to explore exactly what you're feeling. Now, this is something you probably don't want to do initially, because the tendency is to try to avoid the uncomfortable feelings or to somehow change them or fix them. And you may find yourself, actually jumping back into your mind, trying to figure out what to do. But if you're wise, you'll focus again down in your heart and gut area and truly be curious about what is actually causing the emotional pain. And when you do this, you'll discover that the pain actually lessens and softens. It can be a real surprise when this happens. You realize you're there with that part of you that's directly feeling the pain, usually referred to as your inner child. You'll find that a relaxation actually occurs when you do this, because that child will finally not feel so alone and bad and wrong to be feeling the uncomfortable emotions. And being with this part of yourself and allowing the emotions to just be there is what diminishes the emotional suffering. And you don't even need to resolve the problem or do anything to stop the pain. You just need to be there compassionately, without any judgment. And you'll see that your higher self then seems to come present. And you're much more relaxed. And your frequency then rises. You find yourself in 4D consciousness. And insights might then arise. Tears of relief might happen. And you'll find that the emotional pain finally begins to diminish. But I want to focus back on something else again, because it's another way to shift from 4D, from 3D. And that's to become aware when you're listening to the inner critic in your mind. That alien technology designed to keep you weak and in suffering. Always pointing out what you're doing wrong, how inadequate you are, what you need to fix and improve, how you'll never get it right, etc., etc. If you can just learn to catch this voice and consciously stop listening to it and automatically, believing it, it can make such a huge difference. Your frequency immediately rises because you're catching this thing in your mind and realizing it's feeding you lies. You can then just say, "Oh, shut up," and realize how it suddenly stops, because it's not programmed to know how to respond to your awareness of its existence. It's really something. Now, of course, just catching it once won't shut it up forever. But if you can learn to do this over and over again, when it starts plaguing you, you'll see that its power does begin diminishing. The voice gets weaker and less insistent. It realizes you're onto it, and you have begun taking charge. All right, there's another approach that you can try to shift into 4D with when you're in emotional or mental suffering, especially if you don't have a lot of time to do all this that I've just been describing. And that is to realize that your attention probably isn't even on something inside you when your thoughts keep swirling around in your mind. Your attention is likely somewhere outside of your body, in front of your head, within your mental body, which extends further out than your physical body, right? So in realizing this, you can consciously bring your awareness and your attention back inside, into the center of your head, right behind your eyes. And then look out into the world through your eyes. And you'll see that just doing this can jar the train of thoughts that have been circling around inside your mind. You're suddenly inside your head, not floating somewhere outside of it. And it feels really different. And then you can shift your awareness up a couple of inches inside your head to your pineal gland, or your third eye, and see how a sense of even greater power and control suddenly appear. When you focus here, there is a quiet sense of knowing that you can be in command of your life. And if you then send a cord down from this place in your head, through your heart, and into the earth, and ground it there, you've added an even greater sense of steadiness and groundedness to your state of being. You've firmly grounded yourself in 4D consciousness, ready to confidently handle whatever was pushing you down into 3D consciousness. You can actually, you can do all of this in just a few moments and effectively raise your frequency. Okay, so another very simple way you can shift into the higher frequency of 4D is to realize how you may be pushing yourself to change or to do something you really don't want to do and actually don't need to do if you think about it, and to stop doing that. Instead, you just allow yourself to be how you are without judging yourself. And you're aware of how you may be feeling guilt or shame or, you're putting pressure on yourself to do something when there's no real reason to do it. It's just some kind of programming that's telling you that you should. So it's important to just be aware when you're unnecessarily being hard on yourself. And instead, give yourself some slack. Just doing this can often shift your frequency into 4D. So there is yet another thing you can learn to do when you're feeling stuck and repeating negative thoughts or painful emotions. And that is to step into the witness, right? A consciousness in which you can feel as if you're just kind of standing there next to yourself, just watching what's going on in your mind, mentally and emotionally. There's a sense of calm detachment with this. You're just a watching presence that has no judgment, no negative opinions about what's going on, just a witnessing of what's happening. And in doing this, a beautiful calm can enter, a greater understanding and compassion for the difficulty and the pain that you're experiencing, along with a knowing that getting caught in 3D consciousness is just something the human mind does. And, it'll always pass. Thoughts and emotions are like the weather. Moods are clouds that come and go. And there's no judgments about any of it, just observations. Understanding the mind like this and just watching it is part of being in 4D consciousness. And there's another quick suggestion I can make about shifting out of 3D. And that's to remember the power of feeling gratitude, right? We all know this, but we forget. It's so easy to get caught into focusing on what's not going right, what you're not able to accomplish, what you can't have or be. And this, of course, just keeps you stuck in victim consciousness, angry, irritated, or despairing. Whereas if you can focus your attention on what is actually going well, and there are always some things going well, what you do have that you need and want, how life really is taking care of you in certain important ways, and you feel gratitude for all of this, then of course a whole shift can occur. You lift up into a higher, lighter consciousness. Also, very importantly, by keeping your focus on what you're grateful for, more of the same will then be attracted to you from within the quantum field. That's what happens, right? Like attracts like. If you keep focusing on what's going wrong in your life, you're going to just keep attracting more of that. So, all right, so a final, very quick step you can maybe remember when you're feeling stuck is one that is probably obvious, but you may forget at times. And that is to call in divine light to surround, fill, and protect you and guide you. Take a moment to feel this light come in and surround you and fill you and shift your energy. And you can, of course, also remember to call in ascended masters and archangels and galactic beings to help. And this can be really powerful too. Just within moments, sometimes you can just feel such a shift. And don't forget about affirmations. Remember them? They can really be helpful in a pinch. Like if you're anxious, a very simple one is like, all is well. This can take the edge off. You just say it over and over again, just softly to yourself, all is well, all is well. And something just calms down in you. Or another one might be, I am calm, relaxed, and peaceful. You say it slowly and feel each word as you say it. And again, it can quickly lift you into a higher frequency. So, as a brief review of things that you can do to shift out of 3D into 4D consciousness, I've described several ways here. You can, for instance, first of all, simply recognize that you're in 3D consciousness. really important, just to recognize this. And then you can bring your focus out of your head and your mind and down into your heart and your gut. Focus on feeling the emotions there and feeling compassion for yourself, being with your inner child. You can also catch the voice of the inner critic and choose not to believe it. Tell it to shut up. You can bring your focus initially into the center of your head, out from in front of you, and then up into your pineal gland, and then send a cord down through your heart and into the earth. You can simply allow yourself to be as you are, with compassion, without judgment. You can shift into the witness consciousness. You can focus on gratitude. And you can call in divine light and archangels, ascended masters, galactics. And you can remember affirmations. And of course, maybe you've discovered other ways that really work for you to pull yourself up into a higher consciousness so that you can feel more at ease and more powerful and happier. So maybe think about what you've discovered along with all that I've just suggested, and come up with a list of ways you can do this that you can keep handy for whenever you feel stuck in 3D hell. It can be really helpful because a lot of times you can't remember, but if you have a list, to go with, go to, then, you've got that list to look at. So these are some things to think about when you're feeling trapped in 3D consciousness and want to shift yourself up into 4D. Which, although it isn't as free a consciousness as you might like, at least it's freer, more comfortable, more relaxed than 5D, which then gives you the opportunity to shift even further into 5D. And to help you with this, you might want to listen to the third YouTube in this series, in which I describe some of the experiences you might be having when you actually shift into 5D consciousness. And, this is when you can feel totally free and in your full power as a multidimensional being. And you may not realize it, but you probably are having at least brief experiences of this much higher consciousness. And it can be helpful to realize it when you are, and to see how you might more consciously shift there more often. So hopefully you'll take a listen to that YouTube as well. And until then, I send you my encouragement in continuing to keep going forward through these rough transitional times. They're definitely challenging at times, but remember, they won't last forever. And they are preparing you for your final step into freedom. So much, much love to you.